RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. Welcome to part 3 of my trestle table build series. In the previous episode I was cutting out mortises, kind of the hard way. And in this episode I'm going to be cutting out the tenons to fit those mortises. And I'll show you a couple different techniques that I like to use for doing this. And as much of a traditionalist as I am, neither of those techniques actually involves using a sash saw like this one. So if you stick around, you'll see what I mean. Okay, so all my mortises are cut, and boy am I glad that's over with, because that's a lot like work. And now I'm starting to lay the groundwork for cutting my tenons. And the way I like to do that is to saw my shoulders by hand with a carcass saw, and then I'll go over to the bandsaw actually and remove all the tenon cheeks that way. And one of the ways I like to make sure that I don't screw up these shoulders, because these are of course going to be showing later, is to deepen all my knife lines with a chisel. So I'll just drop the chisel right into the knife line. I'm kind of going lefty here for a second. And just deepening those just a little bit, and then coming back from this angle and undercutting them. And in critical cuts like this, I like to do that because it gives a place for the blade of the saw to just settle into the saw plate. So it's less likely I'm going to miss sawing next to this knife line and accidentally saw into the show face here. So now there's a nice little trough for the teeth of the saw to drop into, and now I can go ahead and hand cut this down to my lines that are showing on the edges here. So I have to do that for all of these legs, for every end of each leg, all these shoulders here. I'm going to deepen those knife lines because that helps ensure that my shoulders, which are going to be seen later, are going to drop nice and tight in the end. So it's worth the effort, I think. Here's one thing I like to warn you about before I finish establishing all these little knife walls, is that when I deepen these knife lines with a chisel, I don't actually hold the chisel vertical. And the reason for that is just the physics of the blade. So any chisel is going to have, let's see if I can get this in focus, it's going to have a flat back, right? It's flat on this side. And on this side it has a little bit of a wedge where the bevel of the chisel is. When you hold your chisel straight up and down on this knife line and give it a whack with your mallet, the bevel of the chisel is going to push the chisel in this direction, which means your knife lines can actually get pushed back a little bit and they're not as straight as they once were. Obviously that's a problem because we want these shoulders to be nice and straight and even all the way around. So when I actually deepen these knife lines, I'm actually angling the chisel about to there. And the reason I'm doing that is the direction that the chisel is actually trying to take is a bisection of the line of the plane that makes the back of the chisel and the wedge of the bevel of the chisel. There's a line that's in between those two lines if they were extended that bisects them, and that's the direction that the chisel actually wants to go. So word of warning, and you can try this yourself in your shop. You can drive straight down and see how it pushes back the knife wall, and you can angle it like this and see that it doesn't actually do that. So I'm going to angle it back just a smidge and deepen my knife line that way. And it hasn't moved back at all. So now I'm cutting these shoulders, and you want to kind of immobilize your work any way you can. So some of these cuts I can do on my bench hook. Some of these I'll do in the leg vise like I am now. And some of these I'm doing on the bench top surface because they don't fit in either of the other two options very well. So I'm going to drop my saw plate right into that knife line that I established earlier with the chisel. And I'm starting with the narrow side of the workpiece first, and then doing the longer saw cuts that use up more of the saw plate later on. The less of the saw plate is buried in the cut, the better, because these teeth aren't super aggressive, and they tend to pack up with sawdust and start to produce a lot of friction, a lot of resistance. It makes it harder to cut accurately. So I'm shortening effectively the length of this cut by doing these shorter end cuts first. and you probably can't see it, but my pencil line that I need to stop at is right about here. So I'm going to go right down to that as best I can. And you know, if you accidentally tag it, it's not the end of the world. You're still going to have a really strong joint compared to the other options. So wouldn't worry about that too much. But you just want to get as close as you can to that end line without cutting past it too far. Almost. Right about there. That is pretty good. And as far as cutting straight down the line is concerned, you do get a little bit of help from the knife line that you've put on the front and the back as well. But ultimately, sawing straight is as much a matter of practice as anything else. So that's one of those things that to get good at it, you just got to do it a lot. Now I'm doing the opposite short side. Again, just dropping the saw plate right into that knife line that I made earlier. There we go. That one's pretty shallow, actually. And I'm checking on the back side just to make sure that side is cutting straight as well and seeing how close I am to my final line. Right about there. Now I gotta do these long sides, and in this case I'm going to immobilize it on my bench top. But you can see how I've effectively shortened that line that I have to cut by cutting the short sides first. Now I only have to cut this instead of all of this. Now I'm doing this long coat over here. I have this held down with holdfast. I have a surface clamp pushing it against the holdfast to really help immobilize it, because when you have this much of your saw plate into a saw cut, you again tend to fill up the gullets of the teeth with sawdust, and that sawdust produces friction, which causes your saw plate to expand, and then it gets hard to make the cut. There's a lot of resistance there. So it doesn't help if the workpiece on top of all of that is moving around. So I got everything tightened down real good. And now I'm just going to drop into my previous cut here. And I'm going to stick my thumb in here, which I'm sure is blocking away, but I kind of need to do it just to make sure that I don't jump over the knife wall here. Get that cut started using the knife wall. Just checking my progress once in a while. I'm just about touching it there. Where am I on the back side? I can see the sawdust kind of showing that I'm not quite there yet on that side. So I'm putting a little more emphasis on that end. And it looks like I'm just about to tag it there as well, so that's that. I'm going to flip it over and do the next cut over there on the bench hook. So all of my tenon shoulders are now removed with a carcass saw, and I'm ready to remove the tenon cheeks, and my weapon of choice for that is the bandsaw. So if you're like me and you were a hand tool user, you drank the Kool-Aid and you did everything by hand for a while and then slowly started to incorporate machines back into the picture, the first machine I could easily recommend for anybody in that boat is the one that's hiding back here. It's a thickness planer. This is the DeWalt DW735, and it's a workhorse in a lot of people's shops. It removes much of the drudgery, that is stock prep, so people can kind of get to what they deem the fun part, which is the joinery. So I would probably start with that. And then, of course, concurrent with that purchase, I would probably get a dust collection system of some kind, since this is basically a jet engine that fires sawdust out the back of it, and sawdust can quite literally kill you. So I'd probably get a dust collector. And then the next thing that I personally got was a drill press. It's pretty versatile and very integral to what the kind of work that I do. That said, I think for most people it would make more sense to get a bandsaw next. It's often referred to by hand tool users as the Neanderthal's apprentice for good reason. It removes a lot of the drudgery of doing long rip cuts. And of course, it opens up possibilities of cutting curves with a lot less manual labor as well. So since I have a bandsaw, I'm taking a liking to cutting my tenon cheeks using the bandsaw. And since the bandsaw isn't really designed to cut out precision joinery, what I like to do is cut right up to my line, but not really on the line. I like to leave a little bit of meat on the bone. Since all of my mortises were cut by hand, there's some variability inherent in that. Some of those mortises are probably a little bit fatter than others. So what I like to do is match each individual tenon to each individual mortise, and I kind of number them so I know which one goes with which. And I can trim this by hand to fit each individual mortise perfectly. So that's what I'm going for here. I'm going to cut just a little bit away from my line and remove all my cheeks that way. So it should go without saying that just because this is a machine doesn't mean it's going to do all of the work for you. There is some technique involved here. Of course, I need to make sure that my stock doesn't tilt as I'm pushing it across the fence. And I also need to make sure I don't overcut and cut into my shoulders as I'm pushing. I don't want to push too far. Now I could put some kind of stop back here, but I don't really have a good way of securing a stop. What I prefer to do instead is what most hand tool users are used to doing already, which is to pay attention. So I have a kerf here that I've already cut, and once I reach that kerf, assuming I reach my baselines when I cut that kerf, these cheeks should just fall away. But I'm also paying attention and watching the blade to make sure that it doesn't go beyond the curve into the keeper part of the joint. For an extreme close-up. So you can see there that I've left maybe just shy of 1 millimeter of material there that I can trim now to fit each individual mortise. So I have to set up the fence and try to achieve this for each cheek on each end of each leg here. So I'm going to be busy doing this for a little while, but that's okay. In the end, I think it'll be all worth it. Okay, so that went by pretty quick, and now I'm over here at my bench trimming the tenons to fit the mortises. So I got a whole setup going on here. You'll notice one thing is that I got a little pile of the offcuts here. It's always good to keep your offcuts around from your tenons, just in case you accidentally cut a tenon too thin to fit in its mortise. If it's rattling around in there, you can always take one of these offcuts, glue it back onto the face of the tenon, or the cheek of the tenon as the case may be, then trim that away again in order to get a better fit. So I always keep these around just in case. Elsewhere on the bench I have my sled feet kind of clamped down to the table, and the reason I do that is so I can pull apart a mortise and tenon joint. Come on, there we go. That holds it while I pull on the other end so I don't accidentally, let go and punch myself in the face with a workpiece or something like that. Then I have a planing stop on my bench like so. What I'm going to do is take this one that's already done, put it here. This one needs to be done. This still has the bandsaw marks on it, and it's still a little too fat to fit into its mortise. So I'm going to put that end to end, just like that. And what I like to do to trim these tenons is to use a router plane, actually. So I'm going to bring you in a little bit closer and show you what I do to trim these tenons down. By the way, before I show you this setup, I want to point out that I did go around and number all these tenons and their corresponding mortises, so they all have a corresponding or mating part of the joint that is only for it. I kind of lined up all of my pieces in a way that was most appealing to me in terms of like the grain patterns and all of that. And once that all looked good, I went around and marked everything. So the bottom of every leg has a number that corresponds with the mortise and the sled foot and so on. Definitely want to make sure that each tenon is trimmed to fit each mortise and that you don't get your parts all mixed up. So over here I have one leg sitting end to end with another leg, and they're held down with these holdfasts, which I hadn't hammered down yet. And what I like to do is use my router plane to trim these tenons to fit the corresponding mortise. So I showed you a moment ago I have my sled foot clamped over to my right here to where I can kind of test the fit and pull it apart if need be. And then what I like to do is just come in here, and I always like to skew my blade at kind of almost like a 45-degree angle, depending upon which way the grain appears to be running. On the side, it looks like it's running upward out of this joint, so I'm going to skew it this way and see if it makes a nice clean cut. And I'm just taking a little bit off at a time, and just removing those bandsaw marks already. And you can see that the reason that this other workpiece is over here is that it helps stabilize the router on the cut, instead of having one end of the router hanging way out in an empty space here and then tilting and potentially making my tenon cheek so that it's not in parallel with the face of the leg. I have another workpiece over here to help stabilize it. And then once I get over here to where there isn't anything there anymore, all my pressure is on this side of the router, pressing against this reference face to finish the joint, or to finish the cut, I should say. To my mind, this is going pretty rough. Certainly not as rough as with the bandsaw marks, but I think in the next cut I'm going to actually skew that the other direction and see how it behaves then. And I'm coming in here with a marking knife to make sure that there's no schmutz down in that corner there that's going to preclude my joint from going together. Now, anything I do to one side, I want to do to the other side as well. So I'm going to flip this over, clamp it down, and then at the same setting of the router, I want to come in and take a shaving off the other side of the tenon. And it really just doesn't want to cut cleanly, so I'll point it towards the shoulder. Oh, that makes a nice difference there. Much cleaner cut. So not only does skewing leave a little bit cleaner face on the cheek of the tenon, it also makes it less likely that you're going to blow out this corner of the tenon as you exit the cut. So there's kind of two reasons that I'm skewing the blade there. Now I've taken a shaving off of both sides. I know now that that tenon is perfectly centered on the thickness of this workpiece. That's the way I keep everything centered as I'm trimming the tenon down to fit. And then I'm going to go over here off camera and see how much more I need to trim in order to get the fit, and it's quite a bit. I'll put it back in place, flipped over again, clamp that down. I'm going to take a pass of my marking knife again. I'm going to advance the blade on my router plane. And it's usually only like a quarter turn, if that. And then I back up all the slop out of it, back to where I feel a little bit of resistance again. Because the router plane has a tendency to drop the blade if you don't back this back up against the blade to kind of help keep it suspended, so to speak. So be aware of that, as if you advance the blade of your router, you'll want to take the slack out of this mechanism to keep that from just kind of dropping on its own and messing up your cut. I found that out the hard way. And now I'm skewing the blade in the opposite direction, towards the shoulder this time. And seeing how that cuts. That made a god-awful mess. So now I know next time that I had it right the first time. I should be skewing it away from the shoulder on this side of the leg. Flip it over again. When I went over there and tested the fit, it was pretty clear that I have quite a bit to take off still. As you get closer to fitting your tenon into its corresponding mortise, then you'll want to make smaller adjustments on the router plane in order to get you there. In fact, you might want to even go so far as to take a very small shaving off of one side of the tenon and then see if it fits. And sure, that would make it such that your leg is just a teeny tiny bit offset, but that's the point. It's just a teeny tiny bit. And as long as there isn't any other surrounding joinery that could be adversely affected by that, then it's all good. Otherwise, you'll definitely want to make it such that you're taking a shaving off of both sides every time. Now, this was the side where the grain was running this way, so I do want to face it towards the shoulder. Nice and clean there. And that's pretty much the gist of it. I'm going to go test the fit, see how close I am, and keep removing material until it starts to drop in there. Ain't there yet, but you kind of get the idea. I'm going to keep on doing this until it's starting to fit into the mortise, and then I'll show you something else. Another thing that you may have noticed is that I took a Sharpie to the top of this advancement wheel on my router plane. This is the Veritas router plane, and in my opinion, they should have done this right from the factory. I put a little tick mark there with my Sharpie so I can tell how much I'm advancing my blade just by keeping an eye on that little dot, and then I'll take out the slack until I feel a little bit of resistance. And so that's how I kind of keep an eye on how much I'm advancing the blade each time. Okay, so now I have this tenon such that it just fits into the opening of the mortise, and it makes it pretty clear that there's something going on in here that's precluding it from fitting together all the way. And I know it's not the tenons, because with that method I just showed you, trimming the tenons with the router based on the faces of the workpiece means that they are parallel with each other and they are in line with the faces of the workpiece, which are in turn parallel with each other. So I know it's not the tenons, which means that there's still some material in here that's preventing this joint from going together all the way. And in the previous video you saw that at the end I kind of concluded that this isn't the way I want to cut mortises anymore. This is a method that takes a lot of time and it's very finicky and is prone to error, human error. So in the future, I don't think I want to do it that way anymore. I'll probably use like a router or something like that. But it's pretty clear that I have a little bit of material still inside this mortise that needs some trimming away. So I'm going to very carefully investigate and try to do that. Even with my little dovetail square, it's just hard to see down in there. So I'm going to stop my trimming of the tenon now and work on this mortise and see if I can get the joint fitting together better that way. Now I've trimmed away some material from the cheeks of the mortises after kind of eyeballing it with my square a little bit, and now I got it going together. Come on, like that. So now it's together, and it's such that if I was to unclamp this sled foot, I should be able to pick up the whole thing without the sled foot falling off of the end of the tenon. So let's give that a try. Not that that's a hard and fast rule, but there you go. So if your joint has enough friction in it to kind of hold it together against gravity, that's always a good sign, in my opinion. So now I need to pull this back apart, though, because I notice that my shoulders aren't quite seating all the way down here. And that, to my mind, was to be a little bit expected, because when I cut these shoulders earlier in this video, I always like to err on the side of cutting them this way as opposed to undercutting them and screwing up the adjacent face. So I know that these shoulders probably aren't as square as they could be. So I'm going to take them over to the leg vise and kind of touch these up a little bit with a chisel. And then I'm also going to ease these edges of the tenon here just to ease the putting together of the joint later on. Now I'm trimming these shoulders here to help the joint seat a little bit better. And one of the things you can do is just hold a square up to it and some raking light and see where it's off. You can kind of feel it sometimes even, or see it just by eyeballing across. But you don't need to make it perfectly perpendicular like it is with a square. If you're doing this by hand, you may as well just undercut it, because these shoulders do very little, if anything at all, to improve the strength of the joint. This isn't a glue surface. If anything, undercutting these shoulders a little bit gives the excess glue from the joint someplace to pull instead of squirting out the sides of the joint and giving you a mess to clean up. So what I like to do is come in here with the chisel, and rather than come in here from the side and try to trim it this way, what I've been doing more and more lately is coming in from the side like this, angling my chisel, and then just trying to undercut it a little bit. Just like that. Now I can get that whole cheek there, or this whole shoulder, in just a couple of passes instead of doing, I don't know how many passes that would be, like 6 or 7. Do the same thing on the other side. Come over here, and I can actually feel a little bit of a hump right there. So I think this one probably needs it more than most. So again, I'm just skewing the blade over a little bit to help undercut that. And I got one more to do right here, just since I'm already doing this. I think this side was already drawing pretty tight, so it probably doesn't need much trimmed off of it. And then you just kind of want to go around and make sure there isn't anything right down in that corner there that's preventing the joint from going together. And then when I'm here in the leg vise, I also like to come in here with a rasp, like that, and ease these corners right here. So that makes it a little bit easier to drive together the joint. It also is less likely, because it's not a hard edge anymore, to scrape away the glue from the walls of the mortise. So I like to always kind of bevel these edges just a little bit before I drive the joint together. Okay, let's see if that did the trick or not. Come on. Come on. Ah, there we go. Yeah, see? That tightened up pretty good. So I got this nice and snugged up. I think it's a good fit. It's definitely going to be a pretty strong glue joint, but I'm going to take the belt and suspenders approach later on. I'm actually going to be pinning all of these mortise and tenons as well. So not only will there be a glue joint, there's going to be a physical joint via a pin in all of these. That way, if the glue fails, the joint itself won't fail just yet. It's got a little extra reinforcement. So this is going to be about as strong as I can make it. There's actually going to be some joinery in between these as well to help make it even stronger. So I'm looking forward to getting to that part of the build. There we go, I'm getting somewhere. This is one of my favorite parts of a given project, where there's this furniture-shaped object starting to materialize in my shop, and all of that conceptualizing and thinking about building this, and then going and getting the lumber and the initial milling and the initial joinery prep is starting to turn into something I can physically see in front of me. And so I feel like I've gotten over a certain hump here, and I can start picking up speed. So in future episodes, I have plenty yet to do. I have to make the stretchers, so I'll attach these end assemblies to each other. And there's going to be some cool joinery planned for that part. And of course, I have all kinds of shaping to do, which is my favorite. There's a lot yet to happen, and I hope you'll join me for it. We'll see you in the next video. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.